Bless his heart. Welcome everyone to the St Andrews Union Debating Society, the oldest and some might say finest of its kind.
Hey!
Actually pathetic that time. I said welcome to the St Andrews Union Debating Society, the oldest and some might say finest of its kind.
Hey!
Thank you, that's much better. That's not, but you know, start as we need to go on, hey? Wonderful. So the motion that stands before the House this evening is that this House believes that controversial monuments should be in museums. It's my pleasure this evening to welcome on the proposition Dr. Stacy Boldrick and Dr. Patricia López. And on the opposition we have Dr. Kirsten McKee and Dr. Clare Fisher. Wonderful. So normally before the debate we ask our clerk, who isn't here, to read last week's minutes in the style of something. However, we are not doing that this week, so we will continue straight on with the debate.
Resign!
2 weeks' time, the AGM, everyone, 3rd of April for those that are interested. Wonderful. So without further ado, I would now like to invite Patricia López to begin tonight's debate. Hear, hear!
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm very honored to be here today. Thank you for the invitation. I have to say that I accepted automatically. I just clicked yes. I'm going for the proposition. And then I started thinking, what am I going to say? How am I going to say, how am I going to prove that a proposition is the best idea? The first thing that came into mind was my elementary years schools. Very long time ago, and it was my history teacher used to tell us every single day that we had to learn that history is the science that studies the past to understand the present and improve the future. Very romantic. Then in my first day in the history degree at the University in Mexico, I'm from Mexico, Mexican historian Edmundo Gorman gave us a welcome talk, and he explained history ghosts. He said that the ghosts in history, one of them is that there is not just one truth, that there are many truths. After that, our teachers, one after the other, kept telling us, now you will learn the truth. Everything you learn in high school, in elementary, it's not true. It sounded very exciting. What is a monument? And what is a moment? What is a monument? Who decides to build, what to keep, what to remove? Monuments are mnemotechnic constructions, sites of memory, lieux de mémoire. They are created to remember, to keep certain things, to honor. They have a historical context and a meaning depending on the group that is creating it and the space where they are placed. They are used by the political elite for constructing or maintaining certain narratives, and if they are controversial, it is because they are painful to someone. They remind of terrible moments and doings and people. We find monuments in many ways. While I was doing this journey of understanding why I am in the proposition side, I began thinking about the replaced museum and wax figures. Replaced museums all over the world, exhibiting celebrities and historical characters, one near the other. Can they be considered monuments? We find Lady Gaga standing near Obama, Trump and Mother Teresa, a few steps away from a Ku Klux Klan member. One of these replaced museums in Texas, recently, had to remove Trump's figure because visitors were coming in to punch him. I wonder why. Can you imagine visiting a museum to punch that historical character, celebrity, politician who wronged you? It would be fantastic. Monuments can be memorials. Museums can also be memorials. Monuments can be museums. This makes sense if we think in Versailles, Louvre, a cathedral's ruins, just to mention some very close examples. If we put a monument in a museum, are we depoliticizing it? Trump's wax figure might say the contrary. Museums reinforce collective memory, and they reinforce the values of those in power. So, as you can see, I was very confused. I needed to continue thinking about this. I can say in my favor that I'm in favor of controversial monuments being in museums just because museums are my passion and my life. Because I get money from working at museums, should I say yeah, everything has to go into a museum, it's perfect. It sounds like a good excuse, and as a museum director, I can tell you that, yeah, you have to do that. But it's not enough. A thing that I love about museums and heritage is that there are hundreds of different cases and situations. As a museum worker, you never have the same day than the other. They are never alike. Every day there's something new. Not two museums are the same. So I turned to investigate the museums, the institutions, those amazing places that were born from royal collections, theaters of the world, to show the power and richness and the extent of the empires, to show the beautiful objects that human creates and demonstrate that I own them, to exhibit the trophies I got from the last war or the relics that show my connection with a certain character, a saint perhaps. What is a museum? Are museums entertainment places? Do you wake up one morning and say, like, what am I going to do today? Should I go to the movies? Should I go to the museum? Should I go to a concert? You do sometimes, right? Are they educational centers? Do we learn things in museums? Scientific collections for scholars and students to learn from? Or political tools for the state, status giver for patrons, business people? Museums have been used by states as political centers of propaganda. They often serve to reinforce the values and beliefs of those in power, projecting their authority into the future. So what are museums for? Are they places of contemplation, collections of beautiful objects, artistic attractions, entertainment places, as I already said, or are they encounter zones, places for critical conversations and reflection? And then the question must be different and go deeper. What makes a museum relevant? Can the things that we exhibit in a museum make them relevant? Can keeping memories of this darker side of story, the painful side of human history, foster relevance? And no, I am not saying put them in the museums and add a label. It's not enough. To add labels telling another side of the story, it's not enough. It's a good attempt, a nice first try, probably, to tell people stop doing memes about our museum. It's funny, but that's enough. We put a label. It's not enough. And memes are so good. If you haven't seen them, look for them. There are so many so good ones. We need new ways of thinking about the controversial side of our story. Not only the monuments, all of it. Adding some labels to the existing exhibition, just mentioning something about the imperial trails like the British Museum, to then say they are decolonizing the museum, while they talk about restitution through a printed pamphlet explaining why they are not returning Greek marbles is not enough. For controversial monuments to stay in museums, museums need to change. Some museums, such as the Hunterian in Glasgow, are questioning themselves. Curating discomfort was so uncomfortable to some visitors that they received threats asking the staff to put things as they were. I mean, the curator received like personal threats against her life because she changed the exhibition. The Wereld Museum in Amsterdam and the History Museum in Oslo are also exploring questioning their own history, and through those encouraging visitors to ask more critical questions. Museums should trigger critical conversation, critical thinking, not only about the other and not only to be in fashion or politically correct. Museums are controversial institutions. They are a monument to colonialism and appropriation. No matter what kind of museum the moment an object is taken away from the context, it is being appropriated and resignified by the museum and the people that works there. We cannot be just a little uncomfortable. We need to acknowledge all our history, all the pain. Shouldn't we really push ourselves forward to do it completely? To really get uncomfortable and not only tell the other side of the story, but open the museum for controversial conversations to foster critical thinking? Are museums temples, places of passive reflection, or should they be active forums for questioning the past and engaging critically with difficult histories? We should keep asking questions about museums, about monuments, and about how to create spaces that reflects human complexity, memory, and identity. The moment we push forward these topics into the museums, different institutions will start following. It doesn't matter if it is done in a conservative manner, announcing that it is just a first step, as Hugh Glock's exhibition in London did a few weeks ago. It is forcing stakeholders to change the conversations. We cannot erase the pain nor praise the perpetrators represented in the monuments. We can give them a different meaning. There are some examples already around the world, like Phnom Penh's war camp in Cambodia, a monument to Khmer Rouge genocide, or all the Holocaust museums around the world, inviting us to remember, not to forget what humankind can do. We might not stop making the same mistakes and learning from our history as my elementary school teachers pretended, but we might develop a better critical thinking, and controversial monuments and museums can help achieve that. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Patricia López for her very fine speech, and now cross the table and give the floor to Dr. Clare Fisher.
Thank you everyone for having me as well. So I want to begin with this by stating that I think this motion this evening relies on an exceptionally narrow definition of monuments and is accompanied by an equally problematic assumption that all controversial monuments might actually fit into museums. Can all monuments fit into buildings in the way this motion implies? Can the brief captions and labels that we usually find in them do justice to a monument's complex histories? Moreover, can we even trust museums to be critical of these objects? Or might we also argue that some museums are controversial monuments themselves? So you might be expecting my argument against placing controversial monuments in museums to be an argument in favour of preserving them in their original settings. But that is not what I want to suggest or even support here. Instead, I want to echo what activists have captured in the phrase, "museums are not neutral," to highlight some of the practical as well as conceptual constraints that the motion of putting monuments in museums entails. So to begin very practically then, I want to return to my first question about scale, which is really a question of definition. So typically when we think of monuments, we think of statues. This art form has a long tradition of being exhibited in museums and galleries as sculpture, along with other commemorative objects such as coins or brass reliefs. But what of the other built structures and even whole landscapes that have also been deemed monuments and have been protested for their racist messaging in the same way as statues? Think of Mount Rushmore, the presidential faces carved into the Black Hills of South Dakota, a site sacred to local indigenous peoples. Or the Confederate equivalent on Stone Mountain in Georgia, which features a huge relief of Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and Jefferson Davis, men who fought to preserve slavery in the United States. These monuments can hardly be relocated and accommodated in a museum setting. In fact, both already have museum-like visitor information complexes attached to them, which seem to have very little impact on their overarching significance or their status in the public mind. A group of scholars organised under the banner Words and Monuments have also drawn attention to other ways in which commemoration functions on and as landscapes in the form of place naming. The report begins, this is a quote, "Around the world, statues of historic figures who symbolise colonialism, settler colonialism and white supremacy are being critically examined and often removed. These removals represent a paradigm shift that decenters such historical figures in their midst and responds to knowledges, worldviews and experiences of indigenous and racialized peoples. But these same critical examinations, they continue, are also needed where symbols of colonialism can seem less obvious than a statue, such as place names, they suggest." So their study found out that out of all the national parks in the US they examined, which was 26% of the total, all have place names that tacitly endorse racist or specifically anti-indigenous ideologies, and thus perpetuate settler colonialism and white supremacy on a systemic scale. One example they highlight is Mount Doane in Wyoming, named after the Civil War officer Gustav Cheney Doane, who participated in the Marias Massacre of 1870, which resulted in the deaths of approximately 200 indigenous people from the Blackfeet Nation. The monument has since been renamed First Peoples Mountains. So while this issue of how do you fit a mountain in a museum might seem deliberately rhetorical or tongue-in-cheek, my underlying purpose by raising it is really to emphasise two key things. First, that the question of what to do with controversial monuments is not always going to be a question of relocation in the way that our museum solution implies. What to do with them also demands a consideration of renaming or even destruction. And secondly, the proposition to put monuments in museums drastically underestimates the scale of the issue at hand. If, like the academics behind the Words and Monument report, we acknowledge that place naming functions symbolically to erase, overwrite and oppress the presence of marginalised groups in ways similar to statues, then we also must acknowledge that relying on museum spaces and curatorial strategies as a means to challenge systemic racism is too limited in its address and inadequate for the task at hand. So I'm going to stick with this issue of scale for a while longer, but shift my focus to the more traditional forms of monuments that seem implicit in the motion's framing, namely statues. Protests in the past few years have indeed been sculptural, with monuments celebrating colonists and white supremacists emerging at the centre of public as well as academic debates. In one critical study, the Southern Poverty Law Center, a civil rights organisation based in Alabama, identified 780 statues to the Confederacy that were still on public display in the United States. More than 300 of those can be found in the states of Georgia, Virginia, and North Carolina alone. So the Centre's report was conducted in response to the deadly Charleston church shooting in 2015 that saw a 21-year-old white supremacist murder 9 black members of the congregation in a bid to incite a race war. Soon after the attack, photos of the killer emerged featuring him surrounded by Confederate paraphernalia, sparking nationwide conversations about what to do with associated monuments occupying public space. Many, as we see in the motion today, argue that they should be placed in museums. So that's 780 statues, and that's just the number linked to the Confederacy, not including those to, say, Christopher Columbus, which also number in hundreds. Can all these monuments feasibly be moved into museums? And if they were, what would the implications of adopting this strategy be on the criticality supposedly inherent to such an approach? My hunch is that it would reduce it, not least because such displays become an expectation or not another norm, therefore institutionalization by other means, but also because I believe mounting an appropriate critique or contextualization of controversial monuments relies on an exhibition format that requires significant funding and dedicated space, 2 resources that are not shared equally amongst institutions. Again, this is an issue that pivots on questions of practicality, even before we get into ethical implications of collection, which is now what I want to turn to. Returning to the assertion with which I began, that museums are not neutral, it's important that we resist the idea that museums are simply storage containers of human culture, but rather see them as active participants in the culture wars in which monuments lie at the centre. From this perspective, one that rejects the notion that museums are impartial and somehow divorced from the wider social sphere, the acquisition and display of controversial monuments in such contexts appears completely at odds with the push of many institutions towards decolonial practice and diversifying their collections. We need to remember, therefore, that the majority of statues were created by a privileged class, race, and gender who are overrepresented in museums as well as public space. In recent years, we've seen museums and cultural institutions actively seeking to collect art from communities that have been historically overlooked in their collections. So immediately there is a conflict of agendas here that requires grappling with if a decision is made to accept, for example, a large Confederate statue. So I briefly alluded to the way in which such acquisitions may constitute another form of institutionalization. And while some exhibitions of monuments in museums have sought to distance themselves from the notion that they are creating some sort of shrine to the Confederacy, to use the words of the director of the Briscoe Center of American History in Texas, it really remains to be seen whether such contextualizations can really counteract the value and authority that placement within a museum seems to automatically bestow. And again, this is regardless of a curator's best intentions to complicate our understanding of such forms. Indeed, calls for controversial monuments to be put in museums often phrase the process in terms of belonging. Confederate monuments belong in museums, not public squares, was the headline of one newspaper in August 2018, for example. In some contexts, this wording is used to characterize monuments as antiquated forms with no place in contemporary society, associating museums with irrelevance in the process. In others, however, it is said with sincerity, and is notable for what it reveals about how society thinks about the rightful place of things. So I want to end on this question of belonging, not just because it reminds us of the alienating effects that such monuments can have on particular communities, but also to question what it really means if monuments are thought to belong in museums, institutions that have their own history of exclusionary practices, as much as the statues themselves. In this sense, placing controversial monuments in museums is a logical solution, especially if we want to follow tradition. The question is, do we?
I'd like to thank Dr. Fisher for her fine speech, and now across the table and give the floor to Dr. Stacy Boldrick to continue the debate. Here.
So my first argument in support of the motion for controversial monuments to be placed in museums are that they mark the origins of controversial, the origins of controversial monuments are the issue. And by controversial monuments, I'm not talking about all monuments that might have some sort of association with controversy, but rather I'm concentrating on Confederate monuments in my first two arguments. So taking Confederate monuments as my main category and thinking about the fact that they arose out of power struggles, dominance, violence, and terror in the southern US states, we can think about the two main periods in which they were produced. And this comes out of this Southern Poverty Law Center's 2020 revised research publication. So the first era was during the Jim Crow era in the 1900s, early 1900s to 1920s, and then the second period was during the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. So these were two periods of mandated racial segregation and violence in southern US states. So these monuments serve as public markers of the history of white supremacy, racial segregation, and violence. And the forms of violence include lynchings, police terror movements, and other isolated incidents then and even now. And we know that they become rally points for marches for neo-Nazi groups. The one probably most well known to most is the Unite the Right March in Charlottesville in 2017, which resulted in a fatality. So the second argument in support of the motion for controversial monuments to be placed in museums lies in the fact that the effects of controversial monuments are in themselves harmful. Confederate monuments inflict unavoidable harm on an undeserving people. And my evidence for this is that in the field of health studies, Chelsea Carter in 2020 argued that Confederate monuments increase the allostatic load or cumulative wear and tear on the body caused by stress over long periods of time. And this is for Black Americans. In the field of ethics, Timmerman, also in 2020, argued that there was a moral obligation to remove monuments based on the prevention of collective harm over many lifetimes. So I've talked a little bit about Confederate monuments, and I'm just going to move into the museum for this third argument. So the third argument in support of the motion is that museums can provide the most effective and full interpretation of controversial monuments' historic contexts, also offering reflective and supportive spaces for thinking about them. And hopefully an example that might be familiar to you is the Colston statue dumped into the water by a collective group from the Bristol community, partly as a result of a long-term campaign to alter the interpretation of the monument or to change it in some way without any result. The monument to Colston was on display at a place called M Shed in Bristol, and it was displayed horizontally as it was when it was toppled and bearing the graffiti of the protesters that took it down. And this, it was initially displayed in a temporary display horizontally and is now part of a more permanent display, hidden a bit towards the back of a gallery, but containing a number of different elements from protest signs to other bits of information and interpretation about both Colston as an individual and all the moments in time from the point in which the statue was produced and raised through to its toppling. So museums can provide multimedia effective displays that bring viewers into all the moments in the social life of a sculpture, of a monument. When that monument is contested, perhaps loved by some in a community, but reviled by others who see in them reminders of pain and harm. This is the most effective way to address all angles of these monuments. So I'm going to end there, a little bit early, but a fly has joined me, so I'll I'll end there. Thank you.
Okay, I'd like to thank Dr. Boldrick for her fine speech and now cross the table and give the floor to Dr. Kirsten McKee to continue the debate.
Okay, thank you very much for having me tonight. So let me begin my stance against this proposition by stating that controversial monuments should not be placed in museums, as museums themselves are colonial institutions that perpetuate the same oppressive narratives from which those monuments originate. While I acknowledge that museums can provide context, education and preservation, and that the International Council on Museums adopted a more inclusive and broad-ranging definition in 2022, stating that museums serve society, their fundamental structure remains problematic. Despite efforts to redefine the role, museums continue to uphold and perpetuate westernised colonial ideologies through their design, conceptual framework and collections, reinforcing the very structures they claim to challenge. My key thesis is therefore as follows. True justice does not come from relocating statues into museum contexts, but from dismantling the systems that uphold their narratives in the first place. To expand on my position, I'd like to put across 3 points. Firstly, that museums, by their origins and design, are established institutions of power and colonialism. While the structural makeup of what defines a museum and who designed it has been challenged over the past half-century, its nature and purpose still retain epistemological biases that favour European perspectives. This issue is acknowledged in the Curating Discomfort intervention at the Hunterian Museum, as we've already heard this evening, where the Declaration of Discomfort, created by the community curation team, states, amongst other provocations, that museums are not neutral. They were historically created to reinforce elite narratives, privilege certain histories, and marginalise others. This issue is also, bear with me 2 seconds please, I've just moved my marker. This issue is also examined through the lens of museum practices and the repatriation of the Benin bronzes in Professor Dan Hicks's book, The British Museums. Hicks considers how the creation of Western museums is deeply rooted in violence perpetrated against African people and the clear link between the rise and fall of the Atlantic slave trade and European colonial rule in Africa. Notably, Britain's efforts to end the slave trade and slavery in the region through the promotion of so-called legitimate commerce ultimately paved the way for British colonialism in West Africa and the Niger Delta. Advocating for the return of looted heritage, Hicks argues that museums that continue to hold sacred and royal objects plundered during colonial rule remain enduring monuments to European supremacy over African civilizations. Even eco-museums, by their nature of being a museum, remain structured around Western heritage frameworks, funding and conservation ideals. As a result, they may inadvertently sustain colonial power dynamics rather than dismantle them, as their impact ultimately depends on who controls the narrative. whether they truly empower the communities they claim to represent or merely put them on display. Until this issue is fully acknowledged and addressed, meaningful change within the broader museum construct remains elusive. Furthermore, as long as museums continue to withhold the looted histories of oppressed colonies, any statue or artefact within their walls becomes yet another curated selection of history, detached from the societies to which they rightfully belong. By prioritising individual identities over the power structures that shape them, museums risk reinforcing hierarchies that elevate certain figures while maintaining systemic inequalities in society. Museums therefore do not challenge oppressive histories. They curate and legitimise historic individuals of status within white supremacist regimes. Secondly, I would like to consider that as museums perpetuate the same epistemological frameworks that the erection of these statues uphold, they cannot be used to adequately address the inequities of colonial oppression. Professor Ana Lucia Arujo of Howard University in Washington discusses this in her 2021 article, Museums as Monuments of White Supremacy. Here she highlights that anthropology museums were built on the categorization of non-European cultures as inferior, and particularly argues that colonial violence is unfinished, and as it persists in the present, it cannot be relativized. Meaning that we cannot place historic contextualization on oppressive systems that currently still exist and perpetuate societal inequities in the present day. Furthermore, placing a monument in a museum does not alter the ideological significance of the statue or the power its presence upholds, as its architectural and symbolic ties remain embedded in the wider cultural landscape in which it is originally situated. A key example we've already heard tonight is the toppling of the Edward Colston statue in Bristol, which was pulled down and thrown into the dock during the Black Lives Matter protests of 2020. Although later retrieved and displayed on its side in the M shed, covered in paint and bearing the marks of its removal from its plinth, Colston's legacy persists in the city, with numerous streets still bearing his name. Hate crime in Bristol rose by 12.5% in 2023 to 24 compared to the previous year, with 68% of recorded incidents linked to racial prejudice. Even when a monument such as Colston's is relocated and recontextualised, the deeper narratives that uphold its historical significance often remain intact, rather than being critically dismantled along with the structures that perpetuate them. Another example of this is highlighted in Dr. Nick Shepherd of Aarhus University in his 2020 paper on the removal of the Cecil Rhodes statue at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. This was a catalyst for the 2015 Rhodes Must Fall movement, and in Dr. Shepherd's paper, he argues that although student protesters defaced the statue with feces and ultimately removed it from public space as an act of resistance against colonial structures and their link to present-day inequities, Rhodes' legacy remains deeply embedded within the university and the city. Despite its removal, the university's setting and its relationship with the wider public space within the city continue to honour Rhodes' influence, reinforcing historical power dynamics that his statue once represented. This is further legitimised by the enduring inequalities that colonialism and the subsequent apartheid system instilled in South African society. The statue remains a symbol of oppressive structures and hierarchical identities, even in its absence, merely relocated rather than truly dismantled. However, it was the Rhodes Must Fall student movement itself, the act of defiance itself, that proved to be more significant and impactful than the statue's removal from the university's entrance. Its resonance extended across the globe, influencing protests around the existence of Rhodes iconography at other global sites, the Black Lives Matter process itself, and even shaping the very debate that we're having this evening. This brings me on to my third and final point that I would like to propose for consideration: alternative approaches to addressing the discourses through destruction, repurposing, and public art. Rather than simply preserving monuments, we should critically re-examine their significance within the broader urban landscape and more actively articulate how they reflect the cultural and political contexts of the societies that erected them. This should be questions as part of our consciousness of what makes a modern city within our society and influence how we understand and develop our cities going forward. As public protests and destruction are legitimate acts of resistance, it is these actions that should be focused on rather than the statues themselves. The act of iconoclasm is an encapsulation of a community's perspective on its own identity through a constructivist lens, defined by subjective knowledge and inductive reasoning. And it is this that should be focused on rather than an assumption that current principles and processes are not fundamentally flawed and trying to address decolonisation within an established colonial framework. Namely, that decolonisation cannot be achieved within the same institutional system that upholds colonialism. Our society also exists within a climate emergency, a crisis that can be traced back to the exploitation of resources driven by colonial perspectives. The same extractive systems that fueled imperial expansion and structural inequities continue to shape environmental degradation today. Many statues are made from materials that can be recycled and repurposed to support or finance grassroots community projects that actively challenge these ongoing injustices and reflect contemporary values. The very act of reusing and recycling these materials becomes a form of resistance in itself, one that not only disrupts the legacy of colonial exploitation, but also fosters a discourse on sustainability, care, and resource retention over continued extraction. In conclusion, relocating monuments does not dismantle their power. It preserves the status quo established by colonial constructs, further legitimising elite-controlled institutions, entrenched urban structures, and societal inequities. While replacing controversial statues and monuments, we must challenge the broader systems of oppression that the statues represent. Keeping monuments in public spaces as contested sites of dialogue or repurposing them is more effective than institutionalising them within museums. I leave you with a final call to action. This debate should not focus solely on monuments, but instead should consider dismantling the institutions that continue to uphold historical oppression. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Dr. McKee for her fine speech and to all of our speakers for a very interesting debate so far this evening. So now is the time when we invite speeches from the floor. So anyone in attendance can raise their hand and stand for up to 2 minutes and give a speech, either asking a question to one of our speakers, giving your own point of view, asking them to elaborate on things, etc. There is a prize for the best floor speech. It's a £15 voucher for Spoiled Life. So if anyone's at all interested, now is the time. Any speeches from the floor? Any non-board speeches from the floor? Ksenia, right, sorry, yes. On you go.
Ksenia, thank you for coming. I have just a point for the proposition of opposition. First, we have opposition. Although I fundamentally agree with a lot of your arguments, I think there's a fundamental flaw in the fact that you broadly critique, you identify correctly that museums are unable to adequately represent the statues. But you don't consider the comparatives. Does keeping them up potentially lead towards conflict? Does destroying them lead towards backlash? You point to the fact that because relocating statues into these museums doesn't solve these broader issues. That's true, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not a good idea. Although I think what would be a better line of argument, like one that I would suggest that you explore, or would love to hear you guys explore, would potentially be looking at the way that exhibits often glorify, if not put on pedestals, the objects that they are put in there. Even if they're meant to be critical, they often lead to recurring discourse, which can be actually lead to like adverse effects or lead to being misinterpreted. To the proposition, so overall, thank you for your words. To the government, I would also think it might be interesting to bring discourse the idea that controversial monuments don't necessarily have to be bad. This might be squirreling the debate, but like, what about the Benin bronzes? What about these other controversial monuments that may not be necessarily racist or have derogatory meanings behind them, but do have a controversial history or backlash? Just keeping them in the museum necessarily, is that necessarily the best place for keeping them there? I mean, it could be that those monuments are much better kept in original places of worship or cultural institutions that are more active, that are more adept to suiting those objects. Thank you very much.
Thank you to Ksenia. Other speeches from the floor? Yes, Joe.
Yes, I just have a quick question for both sides as well. Like, the number of controversial monuments, obviously in the UK, and statues in particular, will be vast. And it seems that not only is there the practical consideration of both the museums, it seems to be probably good. Like, museums are pretty large and have large storage spaces. The more important thing seems to be that we'd be removing pretty much all of our statues. And it would be a bit of a shame. I mean, even if you think about Parliament Square, we'd be getting rid of Winston Churchill, we'd be getting rid of David Lloyd George, we'd be getting rid of all of these really, really important historical figures. And it just seems like it would be a massive shame to remove these very great historical figures in British history and putting them out of direct public view. It seems like it would be a sad world. That's what I'm saying.
Thank you, George. Other speeches on the floor? Yes, please stand and state your name for the minutes.
To respond to you actually, to what reason were monuments created? They were created for honorification, for remembrance of our ancestors. But most of our ancestors did not have us in mind, all of us in mind, when they saw the future. So they did not envision, perhaps most of them, the emancipation of slavery, or like liberal women having rights and so forth. Our ancestors do not, our past does not define us, they did not envision us. And in fact, I would say to your point, we should have more monuments to represent the future. So we should walk into Westminster Square and see monuments that inspire you, because a lot of people don't care about history, a lot of people don't care about the past, and I think to bring a nation together and to bring, these there's a certain void in the heart. When you take away a monument, you don't destroy the conflict within. So to rectify this, a monument of the envisioned future, I think, to fill this void that people need. People need monuments, people need heroes, people need a vision for the future. And I think history should remain in the past, the dead should remain dead, the live should live. Okay, I'm not English, anyway.
Thank you very much. I didn't catch your name for the minutes, sorry.
V.
Okay, wonderful. Any other speeches from the floor? Yes, at the back, please stand and state your name for the minutes.
My name is Marin. In reply, I guess I could say, did anyone consider controversial statues being modern ones that have been put up and people just think are really ugly and they're crap? Represent the future and nobody really knows what the law means. Should all of these lobby ones that really like all these museums?
Thank you. Other speeches from the floor? Yep, please stand and state your name for the minutes. Yes, yeah.
So I actually have 2 points to make, one for each of the boards. I'm also studying museums, so I stand for Patricia's points mostly. But studying museums, I also see that I have mistrust in the institutions, especially as people are managing these collections, and they are definitely going to politicize them. So not having the artifacts on display might be a way of depoliticizing the discourse, but also, and the politicization is always looming, especially lately, with the discourses on decolonisation being prominent in museums. But what I want to say is that the iconoclasm is never the answer, as even in this reality of uncertainty and existentialism, iconoclasm can never be the answer, because we need the memory to work toward the future. And that's something that we can never do without, and that we always have to keep, at least in the magazine, in the deposit in the garage, and then put up when the time is right.
Thank you very much. What was your name for the minutes? Sorry?
No.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. Other speeches from the floor? Right, we'll go to board. Jamie, you can start.
Well, I'd like to thank both sides of the House for what's been a very intellectual debate so far. In fact, much more intellectual. I haven't quite been able to keep up with all of it. I'd quickly like to address one of the things that the opposition said that didn't quite sit very well with me. They're focusing a lot on the practicality of storing monuments in museums. I'm not sure how relevant that is to this debate. I mean, you can take Mount Rushmore, nobody's suggesting to cut the faces out and then deface the mountain and then put them in a museum. I think you can also bring a museum, in other words, an institution that helps maintain the monuments to the monuments. And that would for lack of a better word, constitute a museum as well. Now, what I want both sides of the House to do in the second half of this debate is define controversial better, because we've heard, stealing jewels, for example, from Africa as an example. We've heard mountains, rocks. I mean, I'm from Australia, so to mind comes Uluru. The centre, that's a monument as well. That's very controversial. And if we better define controversial, I think we can get a better understanding of the culturally relative context in which these monuments exist. At one point in history, monuments were created and put forward, for example, by women or indigenous people. In that time, they would have been controversial monuments. The speaker over here, we have modern monuments that are seen as controversial just because they don't conform to the status quo. Are we saying that these shouldn't be put in museums? Are we saying that these are bad monuments? I think this is an argument that the proposition can really hit on the head and bring home in the second half of this debate. Museums indeed aren't innocent bystanders from politics. Keeping monuments in museums can make political statements, the same way that removing monuments from museums can also be a political statement. And in fact, that argument is symmetric to both sides of the House. I don't think that either the proposition nor the opposition should be trying to hammer that one home. And finally, I just want to use a bit of a metaphor. So would you argue to remove controversial books from libraries, or perhaps have a debating society without controversial monuments? I'd argue against all of these, and I say that we should have controversial monuments in museums. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jamie. Other speeches from the floor. Mia?
Yeah, so I would like to address some of the other speeches that we had as well about what actually we mean by controversial. Because I think actually the first proposition speaker does give us a definition of what it means for a monument to be controversial. It's something which incites a severe feeling in an individual, whether that be positive or negative. So this purpose very definition, we don't just have to be looking at monuments which are controversial for the reasons that they are particularly angering to people who sit technically left wing of the political spectrum, or people who are particularly affected by conversations around issues like colonialism. But also these are monuments that might be controversial to individuals who sit on the right. For example, monuments which celebrate indigenous communities, celebrate things like queer experiences in particular spaces. All of this still incites controversy, and it is still something which does promote the conversation and flourish the feeling. So her proposition, folk agitation, these sorts of monuments are also something that is within this debate. So it encourages this debate going forward to think a little bit more about just the practicalities and the political matter of whether people ought to be offended or to feel confronted by things which they believe to be controversial in the space of a museum, regardless of whether or not which direction that controversy is directed into, but rather whether these spaces should be safe spaces for everyone to interact with, or whether they should be more political in the stance they choose to take. So proposition might want to talk about things like how museums have a very clear opt-out metric. So if you feel that you're going to be uncomfortable with something which is demonstrated within a museum, you can quite easily not attend that museum, not attend a specific exhibition which is demonstrating that thing, which you might find objectionable. And on opposition, conversely, they may just talk about the idea of museums being safe spaces for all individuals, not necessarily just those who believe that they may not be supposed to be safe, but the quality of access to spaces, one another is important. Let's just end quickly on the idea that opposition are correct that we really ought to recommend the structures of why our museums exist, how they've been able to apply those items to the economic slate, and what exactly it does mean to use a neo-colonial institution. But presumably, by keeping these monuments in these museums, as proposition is spoken about, you are inciting the conversations which opposition themselves say are the first step towards constructing these institutions themselves and having more of a societal view of the reasons why they exist in the first place. So I think it's a conversation and debate about what this conversation might look like would be on. Thank you.
Any other speeches on the floor? Okay, let's go Beata, Alex, and then Pat.
This is my first ever floor speech. So I'm Jamie's not gonna like it, but I'm actually really interested in like the practicalities of could we actually move controversial monuments into museum. There are quite a lot of interesting cases, but I think I'd like to point to an example from my own culture. I'm from Germany, and we have a very dark history with Nazi Germany. And if you, for example, go to Heidelberg and you go to Jüde Tingstätte or to Nuremberg to see the old Reichstag, you will notice that these monuments have not been kept up. Like there's weeds everywhere, the stones are breaking down. We are just having them as a reminder of our ugly history. And if you then look to the US, who is putting since 2015 several millions of dollars into upkeeping Confederate monuments and old plantation where enslaved people were kept, this just kind of points towards a a really big political movement that are still upholding these systems that have put these monuments in place. And I'd like to, point to Germany that there is another version. We don't have to put everything into museums, because I just don't think it's possible. We don't have the resources, we don't have the money. There's lots of ethical considerations to be put up, but we can also make statements in just letting them fall to waste, or as has been said, repurposing them. Thanks.
Thank you to Beata. Okay, let's go to Alex.
Well, of course, museums are not neutral, but that's why we should put all our controversial monuments in here. Well, I'm not going to touch very much upon what is a controversial monument. I think that by this point it's been brought up by others. But the important thing here is that every country has to negotiate its national history. That is an unfortunate fact, and unfortunately, the more that we, especially now that we are in a revisionist moment in history and historiography, we realize more and more that it's an ugly past, whether it's Germany or Britain, France, Belgium, other European imperial powers that need to face what they did with their colonies, or even other countries, even my home country, Greece, that has to deal with its civil war, which it's not doing. So once you've dealt with what is a controversial monument, and you said, okay, X monument is controversial, you basically have to change the conversation from it's a monument, ergo, say if it's a statue, we need to glorify said person and sort of go with a spirit of respect towards that monument, to hold on a minute, we need to discuss this a little bit. Now, museums are not a perfect institution for this, but if you think the other mediums through which we negotiate our national histories, they play a very important role, and they play a useful role. Because the other places where we negotiate our national histories are the media and newspapers, and I don't particularly trust journalists to do that. They haven't been doing a great job. Social media, and Twitter is definitely not the place to negotiate our national history. So that does leave us with museums. Very imperfect, but at the end of the day, they really change the framework. They change the framework from, let's glorify this is like a great moment in our history, to we need to talk about this. And that's why controversial monuments should be in museums as much as possible.
Thank you. Mother of the House.
So Ksenia and also Jamie, I was going to say what they wanted to say, give her the floor speech prize, but I want to just talk about the most controversial movements. So we've not really spoken about, I think, counter to what Alex has said about what controversy actually is. There's lots of monuments, for example, in the Balkan states, when there's been recent Balkan conflict, where they are uncontroversially bad because it's ethnic divisions, etc. And this does incite lots of hatred and lots of violence. So I want to also consider the monuments where they are raw wounds, and often removing them could just cause massive flashpoints to exist, and that's really important. What I secondly want to say is actually the opposite of what Alex has said, is that often we think that social media or the media is not good aspects for us to discuss these spaces in, but it's not us to decide what these spaces should be. It's about what people feel catharsis in discussing those things to be, right? So often you can already have a museum curator, director, or art historians, etc., already evaluate the monuments in the first place without it being in the museum and give the academic view. But often people don't maybe not have the academic language to be able to decode that jargon, and it's often people want to just look at the monument or have a discourse about it in the press, online, etc. So I don't think it actually needs to be in a museum to get all the benefits of catharsis and things like that. But also the opposition's already touched upon the fact that it doesn't have to stay up, it could be elsewhere, it could be in the water, it could be turned up on its side, and that can also be things that are really important. So I just want the debate to focus more on the very controversial monuments, but also just really understand why museums are the best place, unlike all the other comparisons which Ksenia has already pointed out. So thank you.
Thank you very much for all of your contributions from the floor this evening. We'll announce the winner of the prize at the end of the debate. Now it's time to invite the speakers back to continue the debate itself. We go in reverse order, so we'll be starting with the opposition and with Dr. McKee. Wonderful, you're fine.
Thank you. I wasn't all of that, but probably just as well, because I do have comments. Just highlighted a few things here. So first of all, I noticed that we talked about what controversial monuments are, how we define what controversial monuments are. And someone said, yourself, said, it's not for us to decide. It is not for us as sitting in this room to decide how a community feels about a specific monument. It's not for us to define whether that monument is controversial or not. It's up to each individual themselves. And if individuals feel strongly enough about it that they feel that it's controversial, then it's a controversial monument. And it's not for someone else to dictate in the slightest. I think that we also need to go back to this idea of why there are monuments. Monuments historically were veneration of the dead, and through the late 18th and into the early 19th century, they then became part of the urban realm as part of the urban fabric. Now, honourable gentleman over here, Alex, I am surprised with your Greek origins that you did not think about the fact that we also have monuments in the most public sphere of our own cities. You know, as someone who comes from a place where there are monuments all over really important cities, why is it that we have to take them from those sites and put them into museums themselves? I think that also as well, when we think about the purpose of monuments in the present day, really what is their purpose? You know, they are as you said earlier, that they're part of the past. You know, they encapsulate a society that no longer exists. So now all they are street clutter. You know, they just take up space. You know, we need more space. You know, we need more space to live, to thrive, to have our cities over to humans rather than you know, deed-old white guys that we have very little interest in. And finally, I would like to address the gentleman who highlighted particular Winston Churchill as someone that should be venerated. I would very much like to challenge that. Yes, I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
So when I meant reverse orders, we do opposition and then opposition. So Dr. Clare Fisher.
Wow, I'm still sort of taking every comment in. I guess immediately I kind of do disagree with the question of practicality. I think that is very important if we're considering this as an actual kind of potential solution. So thinking about the practicalities of where these huge numbers of monuments might go and how that would look in museums, I think is an important question if it's to be taken seriously as a solution. I do think the questions or the issues that everyone has raised about trying to define controversiality and developing a kind of metric for that is very difficult. And as someone over there pointed out, there's these sort of really, generally badly designed monuments which could be seen as controversial, which I think kind of lends sort of weight to the opposition side, I think. But I guess in the context of today, when we think about controversial monuments, there is that discourse around sort of colonialism and white supremacy. And I guess shifts in that discourse is kind of one way. But when we, again, as many of us have gone back to the origins of monuments and the design process of proposal, you often get things proposed like nature or tree, sort of plant a tree as a sort of a non-controversial option of monument building. And I think, as Chris mentioned at the end, living in that kind of age of climate crisis, nothing can sort of be seen. Those sort of natural kind of solutions to or contrast to monument statues can no longer be sort of seen as non-controversial now. That's not in that sense. So the person who mentioned about the future of monuments, I'd actually disagree that many kind of makers of monuments, especially in the United States, did think about the future and tried to define that in the monuments of what was going forward, the values that were perpetuated. I know in Confederate examples, you have a woman and a child to sort of emphasize that intergenerationality and kind of ideas of across generations. But looking for the future of monuments, I think is again a kind of topic that is kind of worthy of, I guess, another debate and in a different sense, particularly as it concerns those which we might describe as controversial. Just trying to wrap together my notes, but I also agree with the idea that the question of who decides and what kind of case, I guess, a consultative approach, because I know someone mentioned it is easier to, in a way, to be against something rather than for something. And so I think, again, it gets to kind of the issues of thinking about the long term and how we're kind of living in a moment where these kind of things are very much up to debate and decided, and so we don't know necessarily the impact of decisions, and we can't possibly know in some respect, which makes it very hard to judge that kind of what is the best solution. So I guess thinking in terms of I guess acknowledging our positionality and sort of the kind of series of debates and discourses changing over time. So yeah, I'll probably wrap up there before I continue to ramble. But
thank you to both of our opposition speakers this evening. And now we pass the floor and welcome back Dr. Boldrick to continue the debate.
So thank you for all the questions and statements and speeches. They're really wonderful. You've got great critical thinking in this room. So just to go to the point about, are all monuments controversial? What's the definition that we've got here? And I would say that's the slippery slope, and say that not all statues are problematic if the individual they might be representing is problematic. And so I would personally aim to define controversial more in relation to communities, as has been suggested, and specifically in relation to the arguments I was putting forward about Confederate monuments. I would say that monuments raised under authoritarian regimes or regimes based on terror, violence, genocide, those monuments would be, for me personally, controversial. Just to mention also that toppling monuments is a normal part of regime change in antiquity and in many communities and in many periods of history. So just like not all monuments are necessarily controversial and need to go into museums, I would say not all museums are entirely problematic places, because so many museums are undergoing periods of change now. So many museums are questioning their collections, responding to restitution plans, and we see this in ICOM's definition of museums, which also provokes debate. I would say the practices are changing in terms of co-production, where museums and galleries and other heritage organizations, arts organizations, are working with communities to make displays and exhibitions that are for them, informed by them, and not just one community but many communities. And this is what has happened in Bristol with the We Are Bristol History Commission, which led to the permanent display at M Shed of the Colston statue. And I would say also, just to end with leaving monuments intact where they are, yes, not only does that involve upkeep, maintenance, and funding, but there's also the possibility, as was the case in Memphis when there were attempts to remove 2 Confederate monuments there, that a law would be invoked prohibiting any interaction with a monument, touching a monument, turning it into an artwork. All of that was prohibited under the Tennessee Heritage Protection Act. And I'll finish the story of the Memphis monuments by saying that yes, they were removed. A loophole was found, and the monuments were sold quite quickly, and now they are in the National Confederacy Museum in East Tennessee. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Boldrick, and now I'd like to invite Patricia López back to conclude the debate. Here.
Thank you very much for all the questions and comments. I would like to address many of them, probably with an example from home. 2 examples from Mexico. You know, Mexico was a Spanish colony. It's a métissage, I don't know how to say it in English, a mixed country, very, very mixed country. So there was a case in 1992 in the south of Mexico, close to the border with Guatemala. There was a statue of one of the conquerors, Diego de Mazariegos, and a group of indigenous people came over to the town, to San Cristobal de las Casas, the second city built in America in 1528. They came over in 1992 and they destroyed, they teared it into pieces and they brought the pieces home. Each one of the communities brought a finger, the head, an arm, whatever. I am wondering if those pieces are going to be part of a museum in the next years. The question is, like, the people from town, the white people from town, if that can be called like that in Mexico, they were very upset because that statue was part of what made them who they were. So this is to say that controversial depends on who is looking at things. It can be controversial for everybody for very different reasons. The other example in Mexico City, the famous roundabout dedicated to Christopher Columbus. There was a statue, it was a beautiful statue, artistically speaking. There was Columbus standing in the middle, and there were like the 4 priests, the missionaries, representing the Dominicans, the Frailes, etc. The last president 2 years ago decided to put it away. It needed to be restored. People from Mexico City had never paid attention to the statue. It's an avenue that is full of statues. And as you were saying, like very controversial statues. Why? Because in one of the biggest avenues and the most beautiful avenues in Mexico City, there's not one statue of a woman, only men. Conquerors, priests, whatever, but only men. So if you ask me, that's controversial and it's like really annoying. But the president decided to take Columbus down. He didn't ask anyone. Everybody was very upset because we all know the place by the roundabout of Columbus. And if you're going to that area in town, it's like, take the roundabout, Columbus roundabout, and turn to the right. Nobody's thinking that it was like the person who discovered, because he didn't discover anything, who found America, right? So what's happening with this? The president decided to put it down for restoration, and they sent it, guess where? To a museum. Did they ask the museum director? Of course not. Dr. Fisher is right. Practicality and money, it's a huge thing. They are not going to ask us. They are going to send it there. Or they are going to, I mean, if there's some value, money value for the statue, it's going to end up in the house of a politician. It's happened before. I mean, it's Mexico, come on. So that's a second example. You know what they put instead? The head of an indigenous woman. Everybody was very, very angry. In a country where thousands of women are disappearing every day because they are getting killed, and the president hasn't done anything, he decides to honor an indigenous woman. In Mexico City, where we are still saying that Spain is our motherland, he put an indigenous woman. Does it make any sense? And now it's a controversial statue. It's a controversial monument, and we don't want it there. Not because it's a woman, because this president is mocking the women by doing that. It's again a political thing. So what we have to do, this is a question I asked myself the first time I entered like in a higher position in a museum. Everybody told me, you cannot trust them, you're going to become the enemy, they are not going to pay you. And there were many reasons to believe it. And I thought, in which side of the history do I want to be? Do I want to be like with my phone commenting online and telling everybody on social media that this is wrong? Or do I want to try to do something different? I decided to try to do something different. After 10 years, I got so tired that I moved to St. Andrews to do a PhD.
speakers for an excellent debate this evening. Now it is time to call the House to a vote. So, if you side with the proposition and you believe that controversial monuments should be in museums, please raise your hands now. Nice and high so we can see you. Okay, thank you very much. And all those who side with the opposition, you do not think that controversial monuments belong in museums. Okay. Okay, any abstentions? Liberals! Keep them up. If you're going to do it, you might as well do it. Right, there we go. 2, 4, 5, perfect, thank you. Right, wonderful. Okay, so before we announce the winners of tonight's debate, we have to go to board for some announcements. So if we can start with Chair of Ways and Means, Alex, please.
Hello everyone, I'm Alex. I'm in charge of the public debate for 2 more weeks. First of all, big thanks to all of our speakers for coming up. It's been a lovely debate, and big thanks to Birsa for putting this week together. We do these every week, so come back next week to discuss whether or not this House opposes the influence of religion on education. We're collaborating with the Council of Christians and Jews on this, and it's going to be a very, very interesting debate featuring as well Reverend Donald McEwen, the chaplain of the university. Should be a good one. And now the final piece of news from me, which is quite exciting, is that today we are opening our motion suggestion box for semester 1 of next year. So you'll find a QR code on your order papers, and we'll put it up there as well. And that will lead you to a Google form that you can submit your ideas about motions. And I really need to stress this, we're banking on you guys for the debates that we're going to run next year. So please submit. Or if you have it, or if you're lazy and having ideas, just come talk to me or Birsa.
Okay, thank you. Neva isn't here, so we'll go to Competition Secretary Jack, please, for competitive.
Hello everyone, I'm Competition Secretary. So in addition to our public debate, if you too would like to learn how to debate, we run our competitive training sessions every week on Wednesdays at 2 p.m. on the top floor of the Union. They're always beginner friendly, so even if you haven't debated before, please come along, we'll teach you how it works. Please come get involved.
Okay, and Steward of the House, Ariel.
Hello. Tonight's going to be a bit different than usual. We have our pub quiz. So we're going to be in Beacon Bar in the Union after this for a collaboration with the Model United Nations Society. And there's going to be 6 rounds and a prize of very nice Belgian chocolate. So if you think you might know a thing or two, come along and try and get one. Thank you.
Okay, thank you to Ariel. So only really one thing from me this evening, which is to say that we are having our AGM in 2 weeks' time. It will be in this building on the 3rd of April at 7:30 sharp, so don't make the mistake of coming at 8 o'clock like you usually do. Anybody who is a matriculated student of the university is entitled to run for any position and also entitled to vote as well. So do come along if you have a vested interest in the UDS next year, if you think you might want to run for something as well. There are a few positions that are appointed by interview, but those will be advertised later on. But if you have any questions about any of it, come and speak to any of board or myself, and we'll be happy to answer your questions. All of the information can be found in the Constitution, which is on our website, about what position does what on board and so on and so forth. Wonderful. Okay, so without further ado, it's time to announce 2 things. Firstly, the winner of the floor speech prize this evening, we decided to give it to Ronaldo. Congratulations. If you see Alex at the end, he'll be able to give you your prize if he hasn't left it at home like he normally does. Beatrice got it. We're fine. We're fine. Then without further ado, the announcement of who has won the debate this evening. It's relatively close, so I would like a drum roll this evening, please. So, the ayes to the right, 14, the nays to the left, 15, and the abstentions are 9. So the nays have it. The nays have it. Congratulations to the opposition. Thank you all very much. We'll see you at Beacon Bar.